Mr. President, I come to talk about the process that we're in here. First of all, the process that brings us the legislation that is before us. Now, I respect my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who have come together to draft the legislation that we have been debating on and off, voting even less. But that process is short, changes, I think, the Senate and the American people. It is a process that our colleagues, well-intentioned and working incredibly hard, but had no geographic diversity, had no ethnic diversity, had no racial diversity, and that's consequential. It's consequential in the legislation that we are dealing before us. For example, this legislation does very well in taking care of dealing with abandoning mines, but it doesn't do all that well with dealing with Superfund sites, the sites that most Americans who happen to be from disadvantaged communities ultimately reside along. This legislation does much to help with the challenges of wildfires in our country, which I support, but doesn't do very much for the questions of flooding. Flooding that takes place along the Mississippi, flooding that takes place in Louisiana, flooding that takes place in my home state of New Jersey and along the Atlantic coast. So that lack of diversity is not only consequential in terms of the legislation, geographic, ethnic, and racial, it's also consequential to disadvantaged communities. For too long, our infrastructure and transportation system has often been used to divide communities, split communities, where a highway goes through it and ultimately divides the community until the, quote, right side of the track, quote, wrong side of the track. This was an opportunity to actually change that dynamic. This was an opportunity to create equity in our infrastructure system, to make sure that those divided communities no longer were divided and that all of them had a highway to opportunity, to make sure that transit access to minority communities struggling for employment could be realized. And even though there is a transit provision, it's $9 billion less than what we were originally told. But other elements are much, much higher. Those provisions not only have a consequence to the communities for which transit mobility is a critical element in order for employment, it often deals with minority communities that find themselves disadvantaged in terms of mobility to from minority communities to opportunities for employment. I look at the pay-fors. The pay-fors, is pretty remarkable. One of them particularly ends a rebate that's supposed to ultimately end up for consumers at the prescription drug counter. Now, I often hear from people across the spectrum, we need to ultimately ensure that the cost of prescription drugs are lowered. But then here we have a pay-for that has absolutely nothing to do with lowering the cost of prescription drugs. And then I hear that, well, we're waiting for amendments. Well, I have bipartisan amendments. Amendments on flooding, amendments on our national ferry system that many parts of the nation depend upon, and amendments about eligibility for bus terminals, and they're bipartisan. But the gatekeepers are keeping us away. So here we are. It's 5:30 in the evening. We have yet to vote on one single amendment. We have yet to vote on anything today. And so this cannot be the process by which the world's most deliberative body operates under. And I just want to serve notice that as it relates to this senator has no intention of supporting legislation that comes through this process again and that ultimately does not have that diversity of geography, of ethnicity, of race, that doesn't have the committee process which provides for that diversity to be represented in those point of views. I may not win, but I'd like to have my point of view and those of the communities that I represent have a shot. After all, that's what the American dream is all about, having a shot at it. And so 5:30, no votes. This is a fantastic process, but one that I can serve notice on. I have no intention of supporting in the future. I yield the floor.